which were really the world's first skyscrapers invented here in Chicago, which we'll hear about in just a minute. So if you look up, that's our sister boat over there, and then behind it is a crane. If you look behind the crane, you'll see that very distinctive base that's about 3 stories tall. So now we want to look to the right of the building that says 55. The other building over is also a postmodern building, but very, very different. Roche's building is kind of serene and stately. The building to the right of it is anything but. That's designed by an architect from a region of Spain called Catalonia. His name is Ricardo Bofill, and his motto is, "Architecture is theater." So he really wants his building to be noticed. So how does he do that? Well, he covers it with that brilliantly shiny turquoise glass and then faces the building with that white stone, which is doing nothing to support the building. The building is supported behind all of that. But he's got the stone arranged in a way that makes it look sort of like it's the Parthenon taking human growth hormones. If you look way at the top, you'll see that triangular piece that's called a pediment. Looks right like the front of the Parthenon does. To the right of the Bofill building is another brilliantly faced building with this gorgeously reflected glass. This is 111 West Wacker, and as soon as the bridge gets out of the way, you'll note that it has this distinctive kind of etch in the building. Gary Handel, the architect there, refers to that as a meander and says it's meant to evoke the Chicago River twisting through the city. It is going to open this summer as a luxury rental apartments, but it was started in 2007. It's not that it took them 7 years to build the building. They got up 25 stories and they ran out of money. So the building sat there as a 25-story stump for almost 4 years until it was rescued, and then 2 winters ago they began to rebuild it, and now it will be finished. The building next to it is obviously older. It's from 1930, and as you come straight on with it, you'll see that that tall back and the 2 shorter towers give it the appearance of kind of like a big chair or even a throne. That is the LaSalle Wacker building from 1930 by Andrew Grigori. And that chair-like look is a direct response by architects everywhere to a law in Chicago in 1923 that limited the height of buildings at what's called the facade or the street side. Note the parts that actually touch the street, much shorter, only 20 stories. Architects do not like to be dictated to, particularly by a bunch of goofball politicians who don't know anything. They read the law very carefully. It said street side, so they said, aha, I'll just take my tall tower and I'll push it back. It's not on the street, 42 stories, very tall, perfectly legal. And that open area that you see in the front that makes it a chair was also very useful in the 1930s when our lighting wasn't as good, so you get open air, and when we didn't have air conditioning in the buildings. Now coming up on the left is a building, if you look carefully at it, you'll notice that about the last third of it looks different than the first 2/3. It's because the first 2/3 is from the 1920s by Graham Anderson, Probst, and White, the Builders Building, and then 60 years later, Adrian Smith added this last little piece, and when he put the addition on, he joined the 2 parts together by that glass mansard roof at the top, which also adds 3 stories to the building. So it's a very nice exercise in the way that a sensitive architect can add to a building, and what he does is different, but it's not dissonant with what the original architect had in mind. Now, the Chicago River is shaped like a capital letter Y, and we've been going down the stem of the Y, so we're coming to where the Y branches. And this is a very busy and a very prestigious part of the river. And we have 3 buildings here, all by the same architectural firm. The first of the buildings was actually the second one built, that's behind this barge. It's got the porthole there, flying flag. The architects are Cohn, Pedersen, and Fox in New York. This first building is from 1989. If you look at the top, you'll see that there's kind of pyramids on the roof, and you'll note that those pyramids echo the pyramidal roofs on the bridge house that we're coming up to. The 2 towers are joined by a bridge-like element, so the building is saying, guys, I'm on a river, no, the bridges. And then you've got the nautical motif with the porthole window. That also serves to link it, from a design perspective, to the curvaceous green glass building right next door. And that is sort of the crowning jewel of Kohn Pedersen Fox. That was the first one up from 1983. It goes by its address, which is 333 West Wacker Drive. And it is regularly voted by Chicagoans as their favorite building in the city. The reason for that is because the building is a masterstroke of what we call contextual architecture, meaning it belongs not only in the city, it belongs on that spot. Because when the bridge gets out of the way, you'll be able to see the way the beautiful curve of the building mirrors the curve of the land that it sits on. The two shades of green evoke the Chicago River, and with this bright sunlight, you can see the way that the shiny glass acts the way that an artist's canvas does and sort of paints the skyline back at the viewer. I call this building the Diva because it reminds me of the power, the drawing power that a great opera singer or a modern diva like Beyonce has. It holds that spot with great drama. It's hard to take your eyes away. But take our eyes away we must, because over on the right-hand side of the boat, this where we have building going on, which I will talk about, is called Wolf Point. This is where many of the first Chicagoans had their log cabins. But it quickly went from being residential to commercial, and it stayed that way until probably about 1950 or so, by which point it had become really run down and a kind of a sore in the view of Chicago. About 2000, the City Council began to pass a series of helpful tax and zoning laws, the purpose of which was to turn this back to its original reason, which was namely residential. And this whole area now that we're about to go into is collectively known as River North, and is considered to be one of the primo locations for living in Chicago. Now, two of the great anchors of this residential movement are right in front of us. They're both by James DiStefano. The one in front that curves in, just opposite the way the Diva does, this one curves in, is called River Bend. And behind it, the building with the wavy front is called Left Bank. They are from 2002 and 2006, respectively. Now, as we come around, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a gap between this tunnel with the portholes and River Bend. And if you look down at ground level, where there's a person standing, actually, you'll see that behind him is a metal fence. This is a fence for railroad tracks. So River Bend is plunked right down here, smack up against the railroad tracks. And as a result of that, the building itself is only 1 unit deep. So whether you're in a townhouse at the bottom or a condominium at the top, right now they're enjoying this $1 million view down the river. Every unit has a view, but as you can tell, not much longer. Now, you don't have to live in a new building to live up here. There is a concept that architects refer to as adaptive reuse, meaning taking a building meant for one thing and using it for something else. And the salmon-colored building, designed by Frank Abbott, is from 1898, where it started its life as a 10-story refrigerator with many fewer windows and no balconies in it like it's got now. In 1981, the architect Harry Weiss rehabbed it into condominiums. What is the first thing you do with the refrigerator if you want to try to reuse it? You have to defrost it. It took 1.5 years to carry all of the horsehair and cork out of the North American Refrigeration Company. When they did, the building cracked. And you see the stars on the side, which is where they ran big metal rods through the building to reinforce it. They also cut in many more windows and those famous balconies, which allow you to see how thick the walls are. The walls are about 4 feet, which is well over 1 meter deep, and it makes what's now called Fulton House a practically soundproof building. Harry Weiss also did this next little set of 4 cottages. He was a sailor, and the idea here when you see this is that it should look like one of those tall ships with their rows of sails. And he puts up, porthole windows and other things in there just to kind of add to the effect. Now, if you're going to take a neighborhood which is really run down and try to make it desirable again, one of the first things you might build is a health club. And that's exactly what's over here on the right. This is one of the first buildings, 1979, by Gordon and Levitt. This is the East Bank Club. 10,000 sweaty members which includes President Obama and Oprah when they're both in town. Note though that it doesn't have very many windows, and the windows that it has are very small. It's literally turning its back on the river. And the reason is because in the 1970s when this went in, the river was a pretty polluted, stinky mess, which people didn't want to look at. Much more indicative now is the building right behind it. That's Hubbard Place. You can see Solomon, Cordwell, and Benz have done everything they can here to make this, give this as much glass as possible to really maximize the views. And a minute ago, I saw people, you're all looking at each other. Did you smell chocolate? Yes, you did smell chocolate. Behind you, and you can't see it, you wouldn't want to anyway, is the Blommer Chocolate Factory, the largest commercial producer of chocolate in the United States. And when the wind is right, and particularly when it's getting to be lunchtime and everybody's getting hungry, that chocolate will knock you over. A similar sort of reverence for the river is over here on the left. This is from 2002. This is called Kinsey Park by Papa George Hames. This is townhouses, a gated community, but you'll notice this beautiful manicured walkway along here. We were inspired in Chicago partly by the ecology movement, which really got going in the 70s, and also in the 90s, a very well-timed visit to the Paseo, the river walk in San Antonio, Texas. If any of you have ever been there. We thought, we've got a river too. And the goal here is to have a walking path eventually through the 50-some miles that is actually both sides of the river in downtown Chicago. On the right, behind the bridge, is another of these adaptively reused buildings. This is a warehouse from 1908 by Nimmons and Fellows. Along here, you really get a beautiful view of the extraordinarily intricate brickwork in this building. They don't make them like this anymore, I'll tell you. And it's also got a telltale sign that the building has been rehabbed into condos, which is namely, it has these balconies on here. Now, I will tell you a few things about myself while we're out, and one of them is that I'm a native Chicagoan, and I love Chicago, but I will be the first person to tell you that except for days like this, which seem to be imported from the city of San Diego, the weather is not a reason to live in Chicago. I would say you can use the balcony maybe 4 months out of the year at most. But you'll notice, everybody along here has got a balcony, and if you come by in January, you'll see these people. They have down coats on. They're standing on their balcony. They're poking at the grill, and you just hear them saying to themselves, I paid for this balcony. I'm going to use this balcony. So there's nothing like a barbecue in January. And to the right, the building that's kind of silvery gray with the upside-down V's on it, that is the work of a French-born architect, but who practiced his whole life here in Chicago, Lucien Lagrange. That is called Erie on the Park. It's condominiums from 2002. They sold out immediately, you know, that French taste. And so as a result, 2 years later, they built a little sister for the building, not the one in the middle, but the one slightly to the right. That's Kingsbury on the Park. Now, those upside-down V's are important because they're not just giving the building an unusual profile. They're also serving a very important purpose, which is namely that if you're going to be in a tall building, living there, you don't want to be swaying back and forth and getting in the wind and getting seasick. At the same time, if you're going to be spending $1 million or so on your unit, you do not want to have it filled up with structural type elements. So what Lagrange does here is to move the wind bracing or the skeleton to the outside of the building. It's called an exoskeleton. The bracing is on the outside. The inside of the apartments are all nice and open and flowing. And in a who'd have thought it, you see those braces, you'd think that the units that have braces interrupting the view would not be as desirable. Au contraire, they are the most desirable, and if you have a cross brace, your unit is usually more expensive than another one. The park out here in front that's being rehabbed is named for Montgomery Ward, a man important not only to Chicago, but to the history of shopping. Now we shop, how do we do? We shop on the internet. But what are you looking at? You're really looking at an electronic catalog. Well, 20 years ago and 150 years ago, those were big brick type things that came in the mail, 750 pages. If you dropped it on your foot, you might break your foot. And that is all the sort of brainstorm of Montgomery Ward, who was a traveling salesman here in Chicago after the Civil War. And thought, you know, I give people better prices if I sell in bulk and just send it all out on this railroad that we got here in Chicago. If they don't like it for some reason, satisfaction guaranteed or your money back. He was the one who coined that notion. And as a result of that, his little brainstorm went from a one-page catalog in 1872 to 750 pages and 5 million of them out there in less than 20 years. It made Montgomery Ward an incredibly wealthy man, and in a minute I'm going to tell you what he did with some of that money, but all along here is where he had his buildings. Some of them have been torn down to build new buildings, but the one immediately on the right survives from 1930. This is where the managers were housed. This was done by an architect named Willis Macaulay, who worked for the Montgomery Ward Company and used to design a lot of their stores. Obviously, it is not managers anymore because we've got the telltale balconies, meaning people are living here. This is an Art Deco building, and even though it's not real tall, if you look at it again, you'll see those uninterrupted verticals and the beautiful ornament of the building at the top of the first floor, and then at the very top roof line. You have both of the two places that sort of pull it together. So this was the managers. They were connected by an underground tunnel to the Montgomery Ward warehouse, where was stored all the goodies that were going to get put on the train. And this is the warehouse on the right. It is a huge building, particularly for people who are sitting on the right-hand side or the front of the boat. It'll look like it's going on forever. It almost does. It is from 1909 by Schmidt, Garden, and Martin. It is such a long building that the young boys, 13 and 14-year-old boys who worked here as stock boys to pick the orders, used to wear roller skates in order to be able to pick the orders more efficiently. You can see that the length of the building is reinforced by these kind of stripes that the building has. Some are plain, some are ornamented. On a building, those are called belt courses, and a belt on a building does the same thing that a belt on a person does. It's supposed to sort of pull your look together, and it gives this building a long, low, lazy, kind of organic feel, more like it sort of grew out of here rather than was slammed down. And these are the ideas that are behind the work of a very famous architect from this part of the country, Frank Lloyd Wright, who is well known for his so-called prairie style of mostly residential buildings. This is an accidental island created when people were trying to get material to make bricks and dug too far. And then to the right, down where you see the water tower and the barges in the water, that's the Prairie Materials Group, and that in miniature is what this river looked like 150 years ago. And I find it very ironic. Behind you, in what had been the Ward's warehouse, this is now all commercial, residential, a lot of new and upscale boutiques and restaurants. Most of the business that's in here is related to technology. So largely this is inhabited by people who are young, 35 and under. So when they look out, what do they see? They see Chicago's past. So it's the past of Chicago looking at the future of Chicago right over this same river. Now what we have a chance to see ahead of us, on the left the warehouse and on the right the manager's building, this is where I try to give a crash course to people on the boat who, like me, are not architects, in what is it that an architect does. Because I hope you'll be surprised when I tell you that those two buildings are actually the same height. But they don't look that way, do they? One is very horizontal, one much more vertically oriented. That is what the architect brings to the party. They work with very basic principles, proportion, scale, the feel of the materials, but they are artists, and the way that they design and the way that those design interact with human perception gives you buildings that look very different. Now between them you see a building with those big white stone shoulders. That is the second manager's building from the mid-1970s by Minoru Yamasaki. When he was asked to design that building, the people at Montgomery Ward said, well, we are a very egalitarian company and we do not believe in corner offices. Give us a building where you cannot ask for a corner office. And there's Yamasaki. Now between it, on that stepped pyramid, you see a statue. She's called the Spirit of Progress through Commerce. So that was a brilliant idea when you didn't want corner offices. But in 2002, the Montgomery Ward Company went bankrupt. They redid all of this for residential and commercial use. And of course, if you're going to be living in a high-rise condo in the city, what do you want? You want a view. You need the poor architect who got that job and had to figure out. So what they did was to put the kitchen and the bathrooms in the corners so that the rest of it would still have views.
Chicago Tribune.
So Montgomery Ward had actually died 100 years before his company went away, and he gave Chicago one astonishing and long-lasting gift. Who along here, who is not a Chicagoan, has had a chance to go down and look at our lakeshore? Oh, come on. All right. You cannot leave town till you do that. Because if forced to say one thing, I would say that it's our lakeshore which gives Chicago its very distinctive feeling. I can't think of any other huge city in the world where 5 minutes from your downtown office you can walk out and be in touch with Mother Nature coming at you with all guns blazing. But we wouldn't have that were it not for Montgomery Ward. Because in 1893 there had been a World's Fair here. The World's Fair was built on landfill with temporary buildings. It was wildly successful. So when it was over, a number of people got the great idea of, hey, let's just get these temporary buildings out of here. We'll build up the lakeshore. We'll develop it. Money for us all. Isn't that great? Montgomery Ward, who had an office that looked out on Lake Michigan, did not think that that was great. He went digging in the history books. He found an ordinance from 1837 which reserved a 19-mile long, that's about 25 kilometers, strip along Lake Michigan, not wide, but long, and it was to be held to be forever open, clear, and free for the use of the citizens of Chicago, not for developers. And in order to keep the city true to that ordinance, Montgomery Ward sued the city of Chicago multiple times over a 20-year period of time. He was rewarded for this by being made fun of. You know, he's a crazy old man, he's an enemy of progress, blah, blah. But he stuck to his guns, and because of that, we have this beautiful open lakeshore, completely unmolested, open and free and clear for all of us to use. And that's a great gift that Montgomery Ward left us. So we had problems relating to the lake, problems relating to the river. Because from the first days when Chicagoans had their log cabins here, if there was something they didn't want, whether that was last night's dinner or some old boards from a shed or, God forbid, the carcass of a dead animal, they just open the back door and throw it in the Chicago River. On top of that, the Chicago River also started by flowing from the west to the east, which is the right-hand side of the boat to the left-hand side of the boat. What is off to the left-hand side of the boat? Lake Michigan is out there. Where did we get our fresh drinking water? Lake Michigan. So we are now turning the river into an open sewer and contaminating our only source of fresh water. What to do? Well, in what became a typical sort of Chicago way of fixing a problem, we decided to turn it into somebody else's problem. Because somebody got the bright idea that if the Chicago River could be made to flow backwards, in other words, out of Lake Michigan rather than into it, our garbage would go into this inland river, which would then go downstream. It would go to places like St. Louis and cities south of there, and our garbage could become their problem. And that is exactly what they did. They achieved that by digging a trench, which is lower than the base of the river. So it allows, it's not powered, it uses only gravity. This deeper trench tugs on the Chicago River and pulls it in a south and a western direction rather than letting it go east into Lake Michigan. So all of this is done without any kind of additional power at all. It was considered to be a wonder of civil engineering. And it certainly would have cleaned up the river if we had only stopped throwing garbage into it. But we continued our bad ways in what many people sometimes now refer to as the first taste of Chicago, which we sent to the people in St. Louis. And by the 1970s, this part of the Chicago River was considered to be toxic and unfit for any kind of human activity. Well, fortunately, by the boy, that is really strong chocolate now. By the 1970s, we were beginning to become much more environmentally aware, and eventually the brighter lights began to hit on the novel concept that if you would simply stop throwing garbage into the river, Mother Nature will clean it up. What a concept. But that began a very concerted effort to take a lot better care of this river. And I'm happy to tell you that where we are now is now simply considered to be badly polluted. So we are many steps improved from toxic. We are approved for exactly what we're doing, which is on-water activities. No in-water activities, although Rahm Emanuel, our mayor, has publicly gone on the record as saying that he would like to live long enough to see people swimming in the Chicago River again. He's 55, just to let you know what his timeline is. But thanks to very, very pertinent investments by the city, by the state, and by the federal government through the Environmental Protection Agency, and public-spirited citizens like the Friends of the river is coming back to life. And the city of Chicago is now devoting a lot of time and attention to developing not only the walkway along the river, but also to putting in little parks, a petting zoo, all kinds of things which will make the river not only more attractive, but will also make it more of a destination for people to actually go to and visit. So this is where I always like to say to everybody, please come back and see what we're doing in 2 or 3 years. It should look a lot different along here. And one of the reasons it's going to look a lot different along here is not only the improvement of the river front, but also this building that's going on, because there's a lot. This is the Chicago Sun-Times here, right on the left. In front of it now, as the boat comes along, you're going to see the back of Wolf Point. All this construction, what is it? There is a plan. Believe it or not, on this fairly small plot of land, they are going to build, there are plans to build 3 tall buildings. 3. The first, they have not planned the second 2, but the first one is getting ready to go in. That's what all this is about. It's going to be a residential tower designed by BKL Architects, finished in 2016. Its footprint is going to be right along parallel to River Bend. So these people are enjoying their last summer of a view up the river. Number 2, and what's going on here is going to go on over this tunnel with the portholes. Last year they built this tunnel type of thing, a deck, over the railroad tracks, flat roof on which they're now going to bring in sod to create 3 acres of park, onto which there's the crane. They're going to put a 54-story speculative office building called River Point, designed by Pickard and Chilton. So that's number 2 of what's going on down here, and we're going to see number 3 in just a minute. First though, for those of you who are taking pictures, you can see here the very lovely way that the Diva reflects the skyline of the city back at us. You'll notice that down at ground level there are no windows. It's because, in perfectly timed, going overhead, public transportation, which rattles right next to the Diva, didn't have very good soundproofing glass techniques, so how would you like that kind of banging noise about every 2 or 3 minutes? Not so much. So there are no offices down there. There are just mechanicals. The third Cone Patterson Fox building is this inky blue building, just behind the bridge. And just below the bridge, covered with ivy, is another historic building. This is from 1910, called the Great Lakes Building. It's by Hollibird and Root. And you can see that in 1910, look at the size of those windows. The glass in the windows is new, but the size of the windows is original. So you can tell that people were really interested in 1910, but looking out onto here, because this was a very busy port, a lot going on. To the right, this is the site of the 3rd building spurt. And for people up top, you'll be able to see that about 2/3 of this last vacant piece of land is railroad tracks. Well, you can't build a building right on railroad tracks. So what are they going to do? You see just about the last third, this narrow strip along here, that's where they're going to sink the foundation. And they're going to put a 54-story building. If you looked at the building from the side, it would look like a wine glass. It's going to get this very narrow kind of stem, and then all of a sudden it will flare out, because they can only use 1/3 of the land in order to place the building. And Getch and Associates is doing that one. Over here on the left, my second confession, this is a building that's a creature of the 50s, and so am I. This reminds me sort of this is from 1958 by Graham Anderson, Probst and White. It reminds me sort of a toaster or another kind of appliance from the 50s. It's got these crazy pleated aluminum pieces here on the side, but it is not doing a very good job of what one person said was the chief role of a skyscraper, which is to turn land into money. because you'll notice it's taking up a tremendous amount of yardage here, but it's only 5 stories tall. So were the economy better, there would certainly be people who would want to get that building out and replace it with something that was maybe 80 or so stories tall. Room to expand is not any kind of problem here at the next building. This is the Civic Opera Building, also by Graham Anderson Probst and White, with about 30 years before 1920. It has an opera company within it, wooden walls. The opera auditorium is here where you see no windows. But in order to give the opera company a source of income, you'll see that they wrapped it on 3 sides with that huge office building. Really good idea, really bad timing, because this is 1929 and the crash of the stock market. Put the future of the building and the opera into some jeopardy, but they both made it through unscathed. Across the street from it, the kind of pinkish building, notice those sawtooth corners in there. Remember Montgomery Ward, no corner offices. Well, this is a completely different philosophy at work here. This is the 1980s, which was, the greed is good era. It was also originally the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, where they traded for money. These serrated corners give you 16 corner offices on every floor. So, see, the CEO is lining up to go into that building. On the right, we're going to use twin sisters to talk a little bit more about modern architecture. These are 1 and 2 Gateway Center. It's the brown glassy buildings. This is one immediately to our right from 1965. The twin across the street from 1968. And this is really the story of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, then the largest architectural firm in the world, but then as now headquartered in the U.S. Them taking the kind of intellectual and sometimes hard to understand ideas of Mies van der Rohe and converting those into the vocabulary of what we understand of as modern corporate architecture. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means that the buildings have no decoration whatsoever. You'll notice no ornament, no doodads, nothing. Very austere. Elegant, but austere. Second, the building is no longer symmetrical like all of those Beaux-Arts stately types of buildings were. It's very regular in the way that the windows kind of almost seem to march like people in a parade, but it's not symmetrical. And third, these buildings are no longer about being massive and heavy with a big footprint. They're airy, they're light, they're about the space that they enclose rather than the space that they take up in the human environment. Now when you translate that into a building, here is number 3 of Gateway Center. This is from 1971. This shows that you can do those same principles in concrete and glass as you can in steel and glass. But basically what you're going to get at the end is a box. Notice they've got these flat roofs, packing crates sort of. It could be a tall, skinny box, a short, fat box, a wide box, a narrow box. It's still a box. And the epitome of that is the X box over here on the right. This was originally a trading floor from when trading was done by hand signals, so they needed a completely empty and open spot, and they moved the bracing again to the outside. The 4th of the Gateway buildings is coming up here right on the right, and now, however, we've got a real sea change.